All right, on today's podcast, we have the newly minted editor of National Review Online and author of the book Fear Your Future: How the Deck is Stacked Against Millennials and Why Socialism Would Make It Worse, Philip Klein. How you doing, Philip?
I'm doing pretty well.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. I like the fact that your book was a really quick read. It was that makes it a lot easier. But let's dive right in. And actually, first, let's give a little bit of background about you. I mean, you were the executive editor of the Washington Examiner, and now, as I said, newly minted editor of National Review Online. How long have you been at National Review now?
A month, so pretty recent.
What's the difference between National Review Online and National Review? Because when you click the Twitter handle, it just goes straight to National Review anyway.
Well, National Review Online is basically our web product, and then we still have the traditional print edition, which comes out twice a month. So that's sort of the kind of distinction. I mean, in practice, a lot of people write for both. We're sort of a closely knit group, but that's sort of the distinction.
Gotcha. Is there like so there's no wall between the two? It's basically, is there any type of like embargo and stuff that is going to be printed to go online, or is it basically just seamless?
Well, I mean, on anything that would be printed, we would coordinate with online we'd sort of coordinate with print on the posting schedule. It's not like sort of an iron wall where people working on print and online aren't in contact with each other. So that stuff sort of coordinates a lot. Most of the online content is generated for online consumption only, but when we have an issue coming out, articles tend to end up online too. So, but we wouldn't want to sort of kind of scoop our subscribers by posting something online before people get their magazines.
What's the biggest difference between National Review and Washington Examiner so far?
I mean, they're sort of two distinct groups. I mean, National Review has sort of a long tradition of being the sort of bellwether, the sort of standard-bearing conservative journal of opinion and commentary, and we have a news division too that does breaking news and various investigative stuff. I'd say at the Washington Examiner, the balance was more on covering news, and the news commentary breakdown was different at the Examiner than at National Review.
Gotcha. Well, great. Let's get into your book, Fear Your Future. So that's kind of the subject of this discussion here. This book actually paints a pretty bleak future for millennials, people my age and a little bit above. I think one thing that's impressive is that even though it paints a bleak picture, you actually have two rebuttals at the end of this book, which I don't think I've ever seen before, and they're pretty optimistic. And we'll get to those in a minute here. But let's level set. So the book is, the main premise of the book is that the ballooning federal debt is a huge problem. And you wrote this before we tacked on $6 trillion in the last year. So how much worse is the problem? And let's just kind of, if you want to give the audience an overview of the argument of the book, and then we can dive into specifics.
Yeah. So I'll give an overview, and then I'll talk about the sort of addendum of how the COVID experience has affected everything. But basically what my book talks about is about how there are a lot of headwinds facing the younger generation, the biggest being the massive debt burden. And people think, oh, well, everyone's always talking about the debt burden, and nothing, it doesn't really matter. But one thing that you have to keep in mind is that our debt is actually at historic levels now. And that's not just in terms of the absolute quantity. Like, obviously, there's inflation and population growth. So naturally, debt goes, the spending goes up over time. But if you look at it as a percentage of the economy, we're at the point where it's at the highest level since World War II. And basically, if you look at everything from the Revolutionary War, Civil War, Great Depression, every event in world history, the economic collapse, at no point has the level of debt been higher other than at a few years of World War II. However, the big difference between World War II and now is that World War II was a one-off event, right? I mean, once the fighting stopped, our debt started going down dramatically. We weren't spending that money anymore. But at that time, Medicare and Medicaid didn't exist, and Social Security was in its infancy. There were many more people paying into Social Security than were extracting benefits. And so what happens is that right now we're facing a much different boat, which is that we have record or historic debt level, but we're also coming on when there's a massive wave of baby boomers retiring. And in the coming decades, more and more baby boomers will be retiring, taking on more benefits. And you have healthcare costs rising. So the combination of the increased retirement age and rising healthcare costs already was exploding the debt and making it unsustainable. And the problem is that at any point, investors could decide, we've had enough. It's kind of risky to purchase all this debt. We're drowning in all this US debt. We can't stomach more. And they demand higher interest rates for loaning money to the United States. And you have basically a lot of really negative scenarios to worry about, where you have to, worry about high interest rates, the potential for inflation, trade-offs between dramatic spending cuts or severe tax increases. And so that's the problem that they're facing. When you add to that other problems that millennials have confronted, massive amounts of student debt, rising housing costs, difficulty saving for retirement, you have a really difficult scenario in which, as millennials, and the oldest millennials are now middle-aged, as they're raising families and so forth, a lot of the expenses are going to be higher than what previous generations had, and their share of the debt is just dramatically more. And so all of that is sort of extremely troubling. And the unfortunate thing is that a lot of millennials have said that, well, the solution to some of their economic problems is to seek out more help from government, student loan forgiveness, subsidized housing, subsidized daycare, etc. But all of those things are just going to add more to the initial problem, which is the extraordinary level of federal debt. So I think that would be a big mistake. So that's kind of why I'm bleak about the future. And the experience of COVID has just made me more worried about the
Yeah. So
situation.
let's dig into I think what you mentioned right off the bat, which is probably the most relevant metric, which is debt to GDP. Debt as a share of the economy. And right now, as you said, it's right at World War II levels. I mean, we're about to pass it with the 6 trillion. Why does that matter? Like, why can't we just continue to rack up debt?
Well, the problem is that the way the racking spending money, it basically, economists talk about something which I alluded to, called a fiscal crisis. And that's the point at which, again, investors decide that they're much more skittish about buying US debt. So they either won't buy it, or if they're going to take on that risk, they're going to demand higher and higher interest rates. When they demand higher interest rates and you're carrying, debt that's equal to over 100% of GDP, that means that you're going to spend a larger and larger percentage of your annual budget on interest payments before you could spend a penny on any national priorities. So that's one thing that's problematic. Another thing is that if you have an unforeseen crisis like COVID, we're now have experience of how a totally unexplained, clear crisis could come out, and suddenly you have to spend $6 trillion. That becomes a lot harder the more and more you get into debt. Now, nobody knows there's no sort of magic number that economists will say, once you get to X percent of debt to GDP, that everything collapses. However, basically, you increase your chances of having some sort of fiscal crisis the more debt you take on. And also, the subsequent way about it is that you could also take on debt if the investors believe that you'll eventually get around to paying it back. Now, given the US's history, people have faith that the US government will find a way to pay off its debt and so forth, and they feel safe. They still feel safe with US debt. But the issue is that right now we're seeing a huge paradigm shift where, and I talk about the concept of modern monetary theory a bit in the book. This is a new economic theory that's not very well respected within the economic community on the right or left, but that's gained traction politically. And it's sort of a complex theory, but it basically boils down to the idea that debt and deficits do not matter. That if you're the US and you issue bonds in your issue your debt in your own currency, if push came to shove, you could always just print more money and pay off whatever debt you want. And so there's no real upper limits in debt. And they argue that we should just be debating programs on their merits as opposed to using the debt argument. And even though few people would come out and say, few politicians would come out and say, I'm for MMT, it's basically been internalized, I would say, on both sides. I mean, certainly the Trump administration, Republicans abandoned all of the concerns they had about debt during the Obama administration. They were happy to just ignore the entitlement issue and cut taxes without worrying about offsetting it with spending cuts. They were fine doing all of that stuff with Trump. And now Democrats come in and they feel like, well, we're not going to allow debt concerns to hinder our agenda. So he just came in and Biden spent $2 trillion on what was supposed to be the stimulus bill, this COVID relief, and then they passed that. And right after he passes that, he says, just kidding, that wasn't my actual economic plan. Now here's another, series of bills that, we have over 2 trillion in this quote unquote infrastructure bill. But then there's going to be an additional element that's going to expected to have more healthcare and things like subsidized childcare and so forth. But it seems like when all is said and done, he'll propose at least 4 trillion of more spending on top of the 2 trillion, which was on top of the 4 trillion we spent before Biden came into office for COVID. So when you add it all up, you're talking about $10 trillion. And the rhetoric coming out of Biden is sort of, they don't really care about the debt. I mean, if you look at Obama, and I wrote a bit about this, about how Biden sort of learned to stop caring about the debt. If you look at the Obama administration, after he passed his stimulus bill, a few days later, he held a fiscal responsibility summit in his White House and talked about how we can't just jump from one crisis to another and not pay off our debts and keep on handing this debt to our grandchildren. We have to really make tough choices to try to get this debt under control. Now, obviously, he didn't. The debt doubled when Obama was president. But now they're just sort of not even pretending. I mean, there might be some token sort of corporate tax increases that they're proposing, but those are only going to cover a fraction of the deficit spending that they're preparing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to dig in there. I mean, one thing that sticks out is that the Republican Party doesn't really have 2 feet to stand on, which you mentioned, which is, if you're going to get into power and we're just going to issue a little bit less debt than the other guys, then you can't really, be known as the debt hawks, which leaves a lot of people wondering where to go politically. But in terms of the actual, arguments you're making here, I mean, one thing is that, you talk about a fiscal crisis. So I think, John Cochran's done a ton of great work on this, where, basically we're borrowing short-term debt, and that we're using that debt to pay off the debt that we already have. And so at some point, if you're using a credit card to pay off your other credit card, it's going to explode in your face, right? Which is exactly what you're talking about. And if you look at the history of these debt crises, there is no slow burn. It just happens overnight. I mean, we saw that recently with Greece. I think the other piece of this is, the main thesis of your book is that millennials are the ones that are going to have to pay. I think a counter argument is Peter Zaheen in his book, The Accidental Superpower. He makes the argument that basically what's going to happen is that the boomers are going to say, well, we don't want our Social Security cut because there are these mandated cuts in the law if we get to that point. And then the boomers' children, the millennials, are going to say, well, we don't want our parents to get cut. And so the Gen Z is going to be in the middle, and they're going to get soaked because all of the taxes during their main years of earning are going to balloon to do that. And then we're going to get over the hump, and, Gen Z is a smaller generation. It'll start to balance out. I mean, do you have anything towards that argument? Is it just a foregone conclusion that millennials are on the hook here, or is there some other kind of like?
I mean, the thing is, the thing is that there's sort of a great dance, right? Is that you're basically playing a game of musical chairs, right? At some point, the music stops and you're scrambling for a chair, right? So you don't really know what, you can't say 100% for sure, what's going to happen. However, the baby boomers, due to their profligacy, have dumped a huge burden on millennials. And maybe millennials will get away with dumping it onto Gen Z. But again, the problem is if you enter into a fiscal crisis type of scenario, the difficulty of it is that a lot of people say, well, we've gotten away with these and granted, one argument that my side, the fiscal hawk side, has to grapple with is the fact that, for the past 10, 15 years, we've been adding a tremendous amount of debt, and the Fed has cut rates, and we're still like, the rates haven't gone up. There's been no sort of fiscal crisis. There's been no inflation. So a lot of the arguments that traditional textbook economics would tell you, the economy isn't really behaving in a textbook economics way. However, what the history of the economy has showed us time and again, is that you can sort of, markets and the world can behave irrationally for a certain period of time, but usually not forever. And the difficulty is that once you're in a fiscal crisis, it's very difficult to get out of, right? So basically, you can't just say, oh, well, so far it hasn't been a problem. If it becomes a problem, we'll just deal with it then, because then you're in a massive hole and you're in a downward spiral. Because let's say you say, okay, we're going to pay higher interest rates in order to get debt. Well, that means then that you have, how are you going to cover all of your spending obligations if you now have an increase in interest payment component of your spending, right? So then you have to worry about, well, cutting other stuff, but then you have to worry about raising taxes, but sort of significant reductions in the government spending component of GDP and dramatic tax increases reduce economic activity. If economic activity is reduced, you're collecting less revenue. And if you're collecting less revenue and your spending on interest is going up, then that means your gap is wider, right? So basically, you want to avoid that scenario. And it's not saying that, tomorrow you have to balance the budget, right? However, if you were to come up with a plan that basically said, okay, here's our plan for how over the course of decades, we're going to put the spending and taxes into some sort of, functional, stable, sustainable way, then it reassures investors that, okay, at least there's a long-term plan. Because if an investor is investing in a 30-year treasury bond and they see that, okay, in 30 years from now, like, things will be more normal, like we'll get through the huge glut of baby boomers and so forth. There's a plan to contain the growth in healthcare costs and so forth. If you kind of get to that, you have that plan, it sort of reassures investors. And any sort of changes, people have time to adapt to. They have, they're imprinted gradually. And so that's just a much more responsible way to do it. And it could avoid more drastic action. And if you look at, the problem is that the more you wait to do something, the more dramatic the action has to be. If you look at what it would have took, if you look at the early Paul Ryan budgets, and what his proposals were for what type of spending cuts would be needed to get onto a sustainable fiscal trajectory over time, like the budgets he put out in documents that he put out, in 2008, 2009, 2010, every year the math got harder and harder. And now you couldn't produce, if you did the Ryan budget, it wouldn't accomplish anything, because now we're much deeper than we were when Paul Ryan was writing those budgets, 7 years ago. So basically, that's the problem, is that the longer we wait, the more dire the math is. And if you look at where both parties are, which are further than ever from caring about the debt, it seems unavoidable that we're going to not deal with this until that we're basically taking a gamble that we'll never have to deal with any sort of fiscal crisis.
Yeah, I think that, I want to talk about how we got here, but the two ways to get out are, is it fair to say the two ways to get out are taxes and inflating our way out?
I mean, well, I'd say spending cuts, right?
Yeah. So spending cuts,
Yeah, you could
increasing
spend.
taxes
I mean,
and
the
printing
problem,
money.
I mean, the difficulty with tax increases is that you can't really, the difficulty, I mean, what the sort of, if I'm taking my ideological hat off and putting, my sort of sober minded bean counter hat on, then basically it's sort of a revenue and spending issue, right? So the math is you have to have some combination of tax increases and spending cuts to get to a different, to be able to get to some semblance of, I mean, we're not even talking about balance at this point, but basically some semblance of sustainable deficits. However, and I, point this out at my book, it's it's important to note that the problem that we're facing is not driven by taxes being too high. So taxes are, if you look at where taxes are, even after the Trump tax cuts, we're at or above the historic average, right? So
Yeah,
in
you
terms
have
of,
a chart in there for the last 50
yeah,
years of the
yeah,
taxes and the
yeah,
taxes of historically over the last 50 years, I think it's like 17 to 20%, and then spending is just continually going up is the
yeah.
chart.
So basically, if taxes stayed at historic levels, we wouldn't be having this conversation at all. If taxes stayed at if spending stayed at historical levels like taxes, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. So the driver of this is increased spending. The problem is that maybe if on the margins you increase taxes, it could reduce the overall gap. The gap is so massive, when that basically the you couldn't raise taxes to the amount to fill in the entire gap, or else you would basically lead to a massive economic depression, because you're talking about like 50% increases in taxes, and that's not that, that's like in terms of the overall tax raised, you're talking about like a massive amount of tax increases. And again, it's important to point out, we're not even talking right now, we're not even having a conversation about spending staying in line with projections. The argument now is, how much do we increase spending by, right? So it's not even now we're in an argument like, how do we deal with the spending that's already we're not even paying for, right? It's how do we create new spending?
In terms of how we got here and what changed in the spending, I mean, obviously the devil's advocate would be that we have ballooning Defense Department costs. But I would say if you look at, America's about to turn 245 years old. If you look at this chart, all the charts that you have, I mean, most of the time we do not have this debt until basically about the 1980s. It really just starts ticking up. And then when you get to the George W. Bush presidency, I believe he doubled it, and then Obama doubled it, and then Trump. I don't know if did he double it? Maybe came
No,
close.
I mean, it was still pretty high, but it went up, I think. I don't want to, it went up substantially under Trump,
Yeah, he
but
was not a
I
debt hawk is the point.
yeah.
So what changed in the last basically 40 years, where all of a sudden we have this extreme ramp up of debt?
Well, it's a combination of a few factors. So first, it's important to point out that in terms of the defense argument, it's undeniable that, I mean, defense is spending like anything else. So it's undeniable that if we were spending less on defense, then we'd have a lower debt. However, if as a percentage of GDP, we're spending less on defense now than we were during the World War II era, during the Cold War era. So in terms of the trajectory, defense spending as a contributor to our budget has gone down over time. So you could say, yeah, like it's a component of our budget. It's about 20%, let's say 18, 20%, something like that. But probably less in the past year because of COVID. But again, historically, that's a lot less than where it was in the 50s or 60s when we had a lot of Cold War era spending. The main driver of debt has been the explosion of entitlements, which is a combination of more people retiring, more generous benefits, and healthcare costs going up. Healthcare costs, so anything. So basically, in the early stage of Social Security, you had a lot of people paying into the system, not as many people who were collecting benefits. Over time, that balance started to change. And obviously you had the baby boom, which the broad year is 1946 to 1964. So if you look at people at age 65, that's 2011. So basically you had a lot more people retiring and collecting benefits. Then you add to that healthcare costs have exploded over time. So in 1965 is where Medicare and Medicaid are unveiled. In the beginning, it was relatively inexpensive to what it is now because healthcare costs weren't as high, but healthcare costs have consistently outpaced inflation over the past half century. So as a result of that has also dramatically increased spending. So now, on top of that, you have a change in the ideology of both parties, and both parties more or less realized in different ways that worrying about the debt and deficits is politically unpopular, and it makes it harder for you to get things that you want.
Is it though? Because I mean, the Tea Party came online with a anti-debt message, I believe, and then they swept in it was the second biggest sweep in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, but the issue is that it's one thing in sort of opposition, right? Like there have been times when opposition to government spending in the abstract has helped, particularly in 1980, 1994, and 2010. However, when it comes to actually making the cuts that you ran on and talking about specific programs that you're going to cut back, that's when it becomes less popular and people have, balked. So a good example of that is with Obamacare, right? So Republicans ran on repealing Obamacare in 4 straight elections, and then they got into power and they didn't repeal Obamacare because they didn't have the votes. They could have repealed it with a lot of it through reconciliation. They would have, so the 50 filibuster wasn't the barrier. They needed to get to 50 Senate votes, and they couldn't get there. And even people who had routinely voted for repeal during the Obama administration, when it didn't actually do it matter, once they were firing with live bullets, they got scared, right? And I mean, I think that it ultimately takes conviction to make the cuts, and then just watch that, like, the sky is falling rhetoric doesn't like with welfare reform, a lot of the warnings and sky is falling rhetoric didn't come to fruition. But you have to actually pass something, and once you pass it and people see that it's not the demon that it's categorized as, you're able to that's the only way that you get anything done. But you have to have the guts to go through that period where you're going to be bombarded with stories about people who are going to be suffering as a result of given cuts. So what you really have is the situation is, if we go back to the Reagan era, and Reagan did a lot of great things, in terms of winning the Cold War, in terms of you're reviving the economy and the overall sort of American spirit after the Carter years. But the flip side of that was that he also created and enshrined this idea within the Republican Party, that there are sort of no trade-offs, that basically we want to spend more money on the military, we want to cut taxes, and we don't want to do anything about entitlements, and we could do all three at the same time, and everything will work out because we're sort of America. And that was the flip side of his sort of sunny optimism. And the contrast was when Bush came in and he raised taxes and violated his no new taxes pledge. And that's a big reason why he lost in 1992. And that sort of enshrined the idea that like people elect Republicans to cut taxes, and when they raise taxes they lose, because why not just vote Democrat? If it's sort of like Republicans have one job, to like lower taxes, right? And I'm all for lower taxes. I don't have a problem with cutting taxes or lower taxes, but the issue is that you can't simultaneously do that and have all of your spending priorities the same. So Bush did it too, right? So Bush came in, Medicare Part D, prescription drug benefit, no child left behind, large tax cuts, large increases in defense spending. And so then all of a sudden Obama comes in, and then Republicans have a rebirth of this sort of anti-spending, fervor that they had during the early Clinton years. And then, the small government kind of idea comes back. But then when they get in, it's sort of a populist who has no stomach for entitlement cuts and who wants to cut taxes and raise military spending and doesn't see any benefit in sort of deficit spending. So all of these things Democrats have no problem spending money. So at this point for Democrats, what they're realizing is, well, having to pay for spending is what pisses so many people off. So why not skip that part? So that's more and more what we're getting into.
Do you think that there's no Tea Party right now because of what you touched on regarding the lack of conviction? And do you think that people are just trying, like you just basically went through a 30-year cycle where Republicans care when they're not in power and then don't care when they are? Do you think that voters have kind of figured out that these politicians don't have conviction and that it's just not worth putting in the energy?
I think it's different. I think that basically I think part of it is Republicans figuring, hey, like the deficit hasn't mattered so far. So, why make a big deal out of it? So that's some of it. I think the other reason is, frankly, that a lot of the cultural battles are just what fire people up. Like they're not fired up about Biden spending $2 trillion. They're fired up about baseball moving the All-Star game, right? So I just think that the sort of cancel culture, the big tech censorship, media bias. I just think those are all kind of more animating issues right now for the populists than something like we need to smash, like reduce the debt.
Was Bill Clinton a more conservative president than George W. Bush?
Um, I wouldn't say that. I mean, it depends, of course, how you define conservative. I mean, part of it too is that you have to look at Clinton pre 94 and post 94, right? So you have to look at it holistically, because part of it is that the Congress between 94 and 98 was more conservative than the Congress that Bush had, right? So you could say operationally, in many ways, Bill Clinton didn't, he didn't have, he did welfare reform and so forth, and he showed more spending restraint than W. But also the one is that he was again being restrained by the Congress. If he had his way, we would have had a national health care plan in 1994, right? We would have had a much more liberal society had he sort of had his way, but Republicans won. The other thing is that the Clinton was the beneficiary of several historic events. So one was the end of the Cold War. And so even before he came in, there was the so-called peace dividend. But under the Bush era, military spending was already dwindling down. You had a lot of the army base closures and so forth. So military spending was dwindling down. At the same time, you had the tech boom, which was dramatically increasing productivity and leading to huge economic growth. So basically, and you also had the point at which baby boomers at that time were not yet retired, and they were in prime earning years still, right? So, in the 1990s, a baby boomer who was born, the earliest baby boomers were in their 40s and 50s, basically in the Clinton years, and that's typically the prime earning years. So
he had better tailwinds.
Yeah. So he had a lot of those benefits. And then Bush comes in, 9/11 happens and so forth. I mean, don't get me wrong, like Bush was a profligate president, but it's sort of more complicated than sort of who was more conservative.
Gotcha. All right, let's switch gears. So I buried the lead a little bit here because you write about the anti-youth lobby in one of your chapters, and you talk about this organization called the Can Kicks Back, which was about 8 years ago now, and it was funded by I think it was a Committee for Responsible Federal Budget and a few other people, and it was basically to get younger folks, millennials, to care about the debt. The bearing of the lead is I actually spoke at one of their rallies because when I was in college, I started a 501c4 with a couple friends to try to do the same thing, which is get kids to care about fiscal issues. And lo and behold, that's actually a pretty challenging task. But I'm going to quote you here. The demise of the Can Kicks Back, one of the many failed efforts to draw attention to the burden being placed on millennials, is representative of the uphill battle faced by fiscal realists in the face of powerful special interest groups that have billions of dollars riding on the status quo. Who are these special interest groups?
Well, I mean, the biggest one is AARP, and AARP bills itself as sort of this harmless senior citizens group that gets senior citizens hotel discounts and so forth. But actually, it's a massive insurance organization. The way AARP makes its money is not through membership dues primarily, but basically they sell supplemental insurance because Medicare doesn't cover everything. So if you want insurance to supplement what Medicare is paying, then you could get a plan that's a United Healthcare plan, but it sort of has the AARP branding on it. So it's sort of like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, and they get licensing fees through insurance companies to be able to slap the AARP name on it. And so if you look at and in my chart, I talk about AARP's lobbying, and basically AARP, it's not always this way because their issues aren't always in the news, but basically they over time, they're one of the largest lobbying groups. So I look at, for instance, the spending over a 20-year span. This is lobbying spending from 1998 to 2018. And AARP spent $282 million on lobbying. And over that time, that's more than like Boeing, Northrop, some of the big defense contractors. And in some years, they were the second highest lobbying group. Like when, U.S. Chamber of Commerce is typically the highest, but they were right behind on years where, for instance, the Medicare prescription drug plan was being negotiated. And so what they'll do is they always lobby for more government. So they lobbied for the prescription drug plan, they lobbied for Obamacare, and there were elements of Obamacare that were essentially helped AARP, even though they hurt seniors, because technically Obamacare cut hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicare, and seniors were very opposed to it. So you'd think that AARP would oppose it. However, there were elements of the way that the bill was cut that helped their licensing business. And the same thing happened when they lobbied for the Medicare prescription drug plan. Their revenues went up considerably. So they have a financial interest in benefiting from big government. And what they do is they lobby whenever there are efforts like Paul Ryan or otherwise to be able to change the way the system works. They line up and they lobby to make sure that nothing changes. And not to mention the fact that now, because of the way that big business and big government intersect, you have hospitals make a tremendous money through Medicare, prescription drug companies, all of these people have a vested interest in sort of maintaining the status quo because they're getting handouts through the current system. And the problem is that you don't have, talking to the can-picked back, you don't have a counter movement. There's nobody, there's no representative of millennials or Gen Z that is putting a lever and saying, we're going to vote, and we're going to vote these people out who aren't reforming Social Security or Medicare, right? So if on the one side you have people that are passionately, who vote in very high percentages and who are very passionate about, about maintaining the status quo, and you have a sort of muted response from the people who are most impacted by the runaway spending, then it's no surprise why a politician who's only interested in their own survival might, decide that the course of least resistance is to do nothing. And I might add that, getting back to the political point and how things kind of changed and why Republicans aren't angrier about debt this time around, you also have a situation in which the Republican Party has gotten a lot older and a lot more dependent on older voters, particularly as these cultural battles play out, with younger voters increasingly siding with the sort of liberal side on a lot of these big cultural issues, the Republicans have gotten more and more dependent on older voters. And so saying, we're going to cut Medicare and stuff is not something they really want to do, because it's not going to win them millennials to say, I'm going to, reform Medicare spending and reform Social Security. And at the same time, it could cost them among older voters who they desperately need, because they're losing other groups.
What's in it for the AARP? Because aren't they a nonprofit organization?
No, well, the issue is that they make, they actually make a sort of a tremendous amount of profits through their other arm, which is which is the licensing arm, right? And they have massive headquarters in DC, and their executives make high salaries. And so
even though it's a nonprofit, everyone that were the executives, they're all getting rich.
Yes.
So their personal fortunes are being put ahead of what could destroy America.
Absolutely.
I think that's a thought for a lot of people to ponder. We're pushing up on an hour here. Any closing thoughts for the audience on, what they can do, or anything any action items in terms of?
I think that, those of us who do care, first of all, I think that people should care and be concerned about the rising debt levels. And I think that if they are concerned, I think that they should be more vocal and more active about it, and do as much as possible to try to create a counterweight to the predominant narrative now, which is essentially that deficits don't matter, and it's best not to do anything or not worry about it.
Well, I think that boomer may need to now mean a boom of the debt. I think we need to repurpose that label. All right, thanks, Philip. I appreciate you coming on, and I hope folks enjoy this conversation.
All right, thank you very much.